"Sir, I need you to return to your seat now," the flight attendant snapped, her voice cutting through the hum of the airplane cabin. Her badge read Karen, and her eyes narrowed at Daniel Carter, who stood calmly in the aisle holding a laptop. Baggy was a tall black man in a tailored suit, his presence commanding yet composed. "This is first class, and you're blocking the way for paying passengers." Her tone dripped with disdain, emphasizing paying as if Daniel had sneaked. Aboard, passengers glanced up from their screens, some whispering, others staring openly. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice even. "I am a paying passenger. My boarding pass says to a—" He reached for his pocket, but Karen cut him off. "Don't get smart with me. I've seen your type before, trying to slip into seats that don't belong to you." Her words landed like a slap, and a few passengers gasped. Daniel's hand froze mid-motion, his eyes locking onto hers. He wasn't just any passenger, he was the CEO of Horizon Airlines, the very company operating this flight. But Karen didn't know that, and her prejudice was about to unravel in ways she couldn't imagine. The tension crackled as Daniel stood his ground, his silence louder than her accusations. He'd faced this before profiling. Assumptions, disrespect, but today, it stung deeper. This was his airline, built from years of grit, navigating a system that often doubted him. Karen's words echoed a lifetime of slights. The college professor who assumed he was an athlete, not a scholar. The investors who questioned his vision until he proved them wrong. Now, on Flight 214 to Chicago, he was fighting not just for his seat, but for his dignity, ma'am, Daniel said, his voice low but firm. "Check my boarding pass before this escalates." Karen scoffed, folding her arms. "Escalates? You're the one causing a scene." She gestured to a nearby attendant, a younger man named Tim, who hesitated, sensing the brewing storm. Daniel's mind flashed to a meeting he'd had last week with the board, discussing employee training on bias. Clearly, it hadn't reached Karen. Tim approached, holding a scanner. "Let's just verify, sir," he said, his tone apologetic. The scanner beeped, confirming Daniel's seat into a Karen's face twitched, but she doubled down. "That doesn't mean you belong here. I'll need to see ID and speak to the captain." Daniel's heart pounded not from fear, but from the weight of what this moment represented. He knew the truth would surface, but not without a fight. And that fight would expose more than Karen's bias, would reveal cracks in the system. He'd sworn to fix. As Tim radioed the captain, Daniel's phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from his assistant. "Board meeting rescheduled to 6 p.m. Need you in Chicago, ASAP." This wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about proving who he was, not just to Karen, but to everyone watching. The truth was coming, and it would hit, like a thunderbolt. Karen's insistence drew the captain, a grizzled man named Rogers, to the scene. He stepped into the aisle, his expression neutral, but his eyes scanning Daniel with a flicker of doubt. "What's the issue here?" he asked. Glancing between Karen and Daniel, Karen launched into her version. "This passenger refuses to follow instructions and claims a first-class seat that I'm certain isn't his." Her voice carried an edge of certainty, as if Daniel's presence in first class was inherently suspect. Daniel handed over his ID and boarding pass, his movements deliberate. "Captain, my name is Daniel Carter. I'm in seat 2A as confirmed. I'd like to resolve this quietly." His tone was professional, but the undercurrent of frustration was unmistakable. Rogers studied the documents, then looked at Daniel. Recognition dawning slowly. "Carter, as in Daniel Carter?" he asked, his voice dropping. Karen frowned, confused, but pressed on. "Captain, he's being disruptive. We need to escort him to economy or off the plane." The cabin was now a theater, every passenger a spectator. A woman in 3B whispered to her neighbor, "This is ridiculous." He showed his ticket. A man across the aisle muttered, "Typical." Daniel caught the word, unsure if it was aimed at him or Karen. His mind flashed to a memory his first job as a gate agent, overhearing a supervisor say, "He's good, but he doesn't look the part." That moment had fueled his climb to CEO, but it also taught him how deep bias ran. Rogers held up a hand. "Karen, stand down. I need to make a call." He stepped away, radio crackling. Karen's face reddened, but she didn't back off, glaring at Daniel. "You think you can intimidate me?" she hissed. Daniel met her gaze, unflinching. "I'm not the one escalating this. His restraint was a weapon, honed over years of navigating spaces where he was underestimated as the plane idled on the tarmac. Daniel's mind drifted to his journey. 20 years ago, he was a kid from Oakland, working nights at a ticket counter to pay for business school. He'd faced skepticism at every turn, professors who doubted his intellect, colleagues who questioned his ambition. But he'd studied harder, worked smarter, and landed a job at Horizon Airlines. Then a struggling regional carrier. A pivotal moment came during a merger crisis. Daniel, then a mid-level manager, proposed a bold restructuring plan that saved the company from bankruptcy. The board took notice, and over a decade, he climbed to CEO, transforming Horizon into a major player. But success didn't erase the slights. At industry galas, he was often mistaken for staff, not the executive shaking up the airline world. Each incident steeled his resolve to reform the system from within. Back in the present, Rogers returned, his face pale. "Mr. Carter, my apologies. There's been a misunderstanding." Karen's eyes widened, but she held her ground. "Captain, we have protocols." Daniel's patience thinned. "Protocols don't justify profiling," he said, his voice cutting through the cabin. The word profiling hung in the air, heavy with truth. Karen's face flushed as passengers pulled out their phones, recording the standoff in the first class cabin. The air was thick with tension, the hum of the plane's engines barely audible over the whispers and shuffling. A young woman in foray, her fingers flying across her screen. Posted to ex-flight attendant harassing a black man in first class. He showed his ticket, but she's not backing down. #Horizon Airlines. Within minutes, the post had hundreds of retweets, comments flooding in. "This is outrageous." And typical profiling, Daniel didn't see the post. He didn't need to. He'd lived this script too many times. The sting of being judged by his skin instead of his ticket. Karen's eyes darted to the growing audience, her authority unraveling. "This is standard procedure," she insisted, but her voice wavered. Tim, the younger attendant, stepped closer, his expression uneasy. "Karen, I checked the manifest. He's in 2A, and he's flagged as a VIP." Her head snapped toward him. "VIP," she repeated, her tone a mix of disbelief and panic. Captain Rogers, now back from his radio call, nodded grimly. "Not just a VIP. He's Daniel Carter, the CEO of Horizon Airlines." The words landed like a bomb. The cabin erupted in murmurs, passengers exchanging shocked glances. Karen's mouth opened, then closed, her defiance crumbling. Daniel's gaze was unrelenting, his voice low but piercing. "You assumed I didn't belong because of how I look. That's not a mistake. That's a choice." The word choice echoed, exposing the truth she couldn't dodge. Passengers nodded, some whispering. "Agreement," a man in 3C muttered. "She's done." Karen's history flashed through Daniel's mind. He'd seen her file during a recent review of employee complaints. Nothing overt, but a pattern of difficult passenger reports, often involving people of color. No formal discipline, just brushed off grievances in a system that valued schedules over accountability. Daniel had pushed for bias training, but it was still rolling out, too slow to stop moments like this. Karen's actions weren't just personal. They were a symptom of a broken culture he was fighting to fix. The woman in 4A kept filming, her ex-post now viral with thousands of views. "This is why I hate flying," she muttered, loud enough for Karen to hear. Karen's hands trembled, but she said nothing, her earlier bravado gone. Daniel's phone buzzed a text from his assistant. Boards watching the situation, PRs on alert. The stakes were higher now, not just for him, but for Horizon's reputation. He wasn't just defending his seat, he was exposing a flaw in the airline he led, a flaw that let bias fester unchecked. The captain ushered Daniel to the galley, away from the prying eyes of passengers still buzzing from the confrontation. The narrow space smelled of coffee and packaged meals, a stark contrast to the charged atmosphere in first class. "Mr. Carter, I'm mortified," Rogers said, his voice low, his face etched with embarrassment. "This shouldn't have happened." Daniel nodded, his expression unyielding but calm. "It's not just about me, Captain. This happens too. Others who don't have my title. We need to fix it." His words carried the weight of years spent navigating prejudice from boardrooms to boarding gates. Roger swallowed hard, nodding. I'll file a full report. This won't be swept under the rug. Back in the cabin, Tim approached Karen, who stood rigid near the beverage cart, her face pale. You need to apologize, he whispered, glancing nervously at the passengers still filming. Karen's eyes flickered with defiance, but the weight of her mistake was sinking in. She'd profiled the CEO of Horizon Airlines, and the cabin's collective gaze burned into her. She walked toward Daniel as he returned to his seat, her steps hesitant. Sir, I made a mistake, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel sat down, adjusting his tie, his eyes locking onto hers. A mistake is forgetting a drink order. You profiled me. Own it. His tone was even but cut like a blade. Karen's lips parted, but no words came. She turned away her hands, shaking. A passenger in 4B, an older black woman with gray braids, leaned forward. I've been through this too, she said, her voice steady but emotional. Thank you for standing up. Her words hit Daniel like a wave, pulling up a memory of his mother facing similar disrespect at a department store decades ago. Her dignity unshaken, but her heart heavy. He nodded at the woman, a silent acknowledgement of their shared struggle. The cabin was quieter now, but the tension lingered. Passengers whispering about the viral X-post that had amassed thousands of shares. Horizon Airlines CEO humiliated by own employee #. Justice on Flight 214. Daniel's phone buzzed again, his PR team media's picking up the story. Need your input, he exhaled, knowing this wasn't just about one flight attendant's bias. It was about the system that let it slide, the training he'd pushed for but hadn't fully taken root. As the plane began its descent into Chicago, he resolved to use this moment not for revenge, but to force change. Karen's apology was a start, but the real turning point would be what came next, exposing the cracks in Horizon's culture and ensuring no passenger faced this again. The plane touched down in Chicago, the cabin still humming with whispers as passengers gathered their bags. Daniel remained in his seat, scrolling through the flood of notifications on his phone. The X-post had exploded, now trending with over 50,000 shares and a hashtag justice on Flight 214. Reporters were already messaging for comments, and Horizon's PR team was in damage control. Daniel's focus, though, was on what came next. This wasn't just about clearing his name, it was about accountability. In a private airport office, Daniel sat across from Karen and Captain Rogers. The room was stark, fluorescent lights buzzing. Overhead, Karen's earlier defiance was gone, replaced by a nervous fidgeting with her badge. Mr. Carter, I'm truly sorry, she said, her voice cracking. I didn't realize who you were. Daniel leaned forward, his gaze steady. That's the problem. It shouldn't matter who I am. No one deserves what you did. His words were calm but unyielding, cutting through her excuses. Rogers shifted uncomfortably, adding, I've recommended a review of the incident. This won't be ignored. Daniel didn't want Karen fired. Retribution wouldn't fix the root issue. Instead, he mandated her suspension pending mandatory bias retraining. You'll learn, or you won't work here, he said. Karen nodded, her face flushed with shame. Daniel's mind flashed to a board meeting months ago where he'd argued for stronger diversity policies. The board had dragged their feet, citing costs. Now, with the world watching, they'd have no choice but to act. He issued a company-wide directive from the airport, an immediate audit of all bias-related complaints, and a revamped training program effective within weeks. He also agreed a passenger feedback portal to catch issues before they escalated. The decision wasn't just about optics, it was personal. Daniel remembered his first flight as a teenager when a gate agent questioned his ticket with the same suspicion Karen had shown. He'd sworn then to rise above it, and now, as CEO, he could ensure others didn't face the same dot. As Daniel left the office, Rogers shook his hand. You're doing the right thing, sir. Daniel nodded, but felt the weight of the work ahead. The viral post had sparked outrage, but outrage faded. Real change required persistence. By the time he reached his Chicago hotel, Horizon's stock had dipped slightly. But Daniel was already drafting a public statement. Horizon Airlines acknowledges today's incident and is committed to immediate action. Bias has no place in our skies. He knew the road to reform would be long, But this was the first step of resolution, not just for him, but for every passenger who'd ever been made to feel they didn't belong. Daniel sat in his Chicago office, the city skyline framed. By the window, a stark contrast to the storm still swirling online. His phone buzzed with messages, some from passengers, others from employees, and one that stopped him cold. A young black man, barely 20, wrote on X, "I want to be a CEO like you someday. Thank you for showing me it's possible." Daniel's throat tightened. He thought of himself at that age, scraping by, doubted by those who couldn't see past his skin. That message wasn't just praise, it was a reminder of why he'd fought so hard to lead Horizon Airlines. The viral post from Flight 214 had ignited a firestorm, with over 100,000 shares and news outlets dissecting the incident. Daniel's statement, "Bias has no place in our skies," was quoted everywhere, but he knew words weren't enough. He'd spent the week pushing the board for systemic changes, mandatory bias training, a diversity task force, and a public commitment to accountability. The board, rattled by the PR crisis, finally agreed. But Daniel felt the weight of the bigger fight. One airline couldn't fix society's flaws, and every step forward met resistance. He reflected on a memory from early in his career when a mentor, a rare black executive, told him, "You'll have to be twice as good to get half the respect." That truth had driven him to transform Horizon from a failing regional carrier into a national leader. Yet even as CEO, he'd faced Karen's suspicion, a mirror of the systemic bias he'd battled his whole life. The incident wasn't just personal, it was a call to action. Daniel took his fight beyond Horizon, speaking at an aviation conference days later, where he shared the stage with regulators and competitors. "This isn't about one flight," he said, his voice steady. "It's about every passenger who's ever been profiled." His speech sparked commitments from other airlines to review their policies. And #Justice on Flight 214 became a rallying cry for industry reform. He met with advocacy groups, pushing for federal guidelines on passenger treatment. Knowing change would take years but refusing to back down. Back at his desk, Daniel reread the young man's message. It grounded him, a reminder that his stand wasn't just about policy but about showing others what was possible. The fight for fairness wasn't over bias, lingered in quiet corners, in unchecked assumptions, in systems slow to change. But Daniel's resolve was ironclad. He'd exposed a crack in Horizon's culture and forced it to the surface. Now, he'd keep pushing, not just for himself, but for every person who'd ever been told they didn't belong.